How I discovered my partner was keeping secrets. How I discovered my partner was keeping secrets. It was a small thing that first made me wonder, something so insignificant that I almost ignored it. I was cleaning up after dinner when I noticed a strange smell in the kitchen, a faint metallic scent that didn't belong. I searched everywhere, thinking maybe a pipe was leaking or something had spoiled, but I couldn't find the source. My partner, Alex, shrugged it off, saying I was probably just imagining it. But I knew my own home, and I knew that smell hadn't been there before. Over the next few weeks, more little things started to pile up. Alex would come home later than usual without an explanation, brushing me off when I asked where they'd been. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find them staring at the ceiling, lost in thought, their face tight with something that looked a lot like fear. And then there was the drawer, the one in our bedroom that I'd never been able to open. Alex had told me it was broken, that the key had been lost years ago, and I'd believed them because why wouldn't I? But now, every time I looked at that drawer, I felt this gnawing curiosity, this urge to find out what was inside. One night, while Alex was in the shower, I couldn't resist any longer. I grabbed a hairpin and went to work on the lock, my hands shaking, my heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, there was a click, and the drawer slid open. Inside was a small wooden box, plain and unassuming. But when I opened it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The box was filled with photographs, all of the same person, a woman I didn't recognize. In every picture, she was smiling, but there was something strange about her eyes, something hollow and haunting. There was also a piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, with what looked like an old address scrawled across it. I shoved the box back into the drawer and locked it, my mind racing. Who was this woman? Why did Alex have these pictures, and why hadn't they told me about her? That night, I confronted them, but they just stared at me, expressionless, and said, "You shouldn't have looked." There was a coldness in their voice that I'd never heard before, and I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. They refused to explain, refused to tell me anything more, and I was left with more questions than answers. Over the next few days, Alex became distant, almost like they were a stranger in our own home. They'd disappear for hours, sometimes days, without telling me where they were going, and when I tried to ask, they'd give me this blank, soulless stare that made my blood run cold. I started to dig, desperate to find answers. I searched through every document, every old photograph, anything that might give me a clue, but it was like Alex had erased their past, like they'd never existed before we met. Then, one night, I decided to go to the address on the paper in the drawer. It was a long drive, out to a part of town I'd never been to before, a rundown house at the end of a dark, narrow street. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown with weeds, but something drew me inside. The house was empty, silent except for the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I wandered through the rooms, my flashlight casting eerie shadows, and that's when I found it, a picture of Alex, taken years ago, with that same woman from the photos. They looked happy, close, almost like a couple. I felt sick to my stomach, my mind spinning with possibilities. Had Alex been hiding an entire life from me? And if so, why? As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze, fear clawing at my throat, but when I turned, no one was there. I ran out of that house as fast as I could, not stopping until I was safe in my car. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me with a look of pure hatred. I barely slept that night, haunted by the image of that woman, by the thought of Alex and the secrets they'd kept from me. The next day, I confronted them again, demanded to know the truth. They just laughed, a cold, empty sound that sent shivers down my spine. "She's not gone, you know," they said, their voice barely a whisper. "She's still watching, still waiting." I didn't understand, but I could see the fear in their eyes, the guilt that they couldn't hide. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find Alex talking in their sleep, mumbling things I couldn't understand, things that sounded like names, places, memories they'd buried long ago. I started hearing strange noises in the house, whispers in the dark, footsteps that didn't belong to either of us. One night, I woke up to find Alex standing at the foot of the bed, staring down at me with a look of pure hatred, their eyes dark and unrecognizable. I tried to speak, but my voice was gone, trapped in my throat. They leaned down, whispered in my ear, "She's never leaving," and then they walked out of the room, leaving me trembling in the darkness. I don't know what happened to Alex, don't know if they're still the person I fell in love with, or if something darker has taken their place. All I know is that our home doesn't feel like ours anymore, that every time I look at them, I see that woman's face, her hollow eyes staring back at me. And every night, I hear her voice, whispering my name, calling me back to that house, to the secrets I was never meant to uncover. The day my pet taught me an important lesson. The day my pet taught me an important lesson. When I first got Chester, a scrappy little terrier mix with a knack for finding trouble, I had no idea how much my life was going to change. Chester was supposed to be a companion, something to keep me company in my small, creaky apartment. But it turned out that Chester was much more than a loyal pet, he was the best friend I'd ever had. He was quirky, with an intense look in his eyes that always seemed to know more than he let on. He had this way of staring at me like he was trying to communicate something I could never quite understand, like there was a secret he was desperate to share. I never thought much of it until that day, the day I realized Chester had been trying to teach me something all along. It started out like any other morning, the soft light creeping in through the window, illuminating the dust in the air, the quiet hum of the city outside. Chester was unusually restless, pacing around the room, sniffing the air with a strange intensity. I figured he'd heard something, a car backfiring, someone moving furniture in the apartment next door, but the way he looked at me was different. There was urgency in his eyes, almost a sense of fear, like he was trying to tell me something was wrong. I brushed it off, distracted by my own morning routine. But Chester wouldn't let up. He kept pacing, barking in short, sharp bursts that echoed through the quiet apartment. I knelt down, tried to calm him, but he was inconsolable, pulling at the hem of my pants with his teeth, tugging me toward the door with more force than I'd ever seen in him before. I tried to laugh it off, but there was something unsettling about it, something in the way he wouldn't look away, his eyes wide and pleading. All right, I sighed, grabbing his leash. Maybe he just needed some fresh air, I thought. I opened the door, and he shot out into the hallway, his little paws echoing on the floor, his body tense and ready. But as I followed him outside, I noticed something strange. The street was empty, unnaturally quiet for this time of day. There was an eerie stillness, the usual bustle and noise gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Chester tugged me down the street, pulling with a determination that I'd never seen before, guiding me down alleyways and side streets that I'd never taken. My heart started to race as I realized we were heading toward the old abandoned house at the edge of town, the one everyone said was haunted, the one parents warned their kids about. I'd never been near it before, never had a reason to, but now Chester seemed intent on leading me there, his nose low to the ground, his tail held high like he was on a mission. We reached the house, its windows dark and empty, the paint peeling off the walls like dead skin. Chester scratched at the door, whimpering softly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to turn back, to take him home, but something held me there, some unspoken bond between us that compelled me to trust him. I opened the door, the old wood creaking beneath my fingers, and we stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay hanging heavy in the air. Chester led me through the dark, empty rooms, his paws silent on the floorboards as he guided me deeper into the house. I felt a growing unease, a sense of dread that built with each step, but I couldn't stop. Chester was on a mission, and I was trapped in his wake, following him down a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, we reached a door at the end of the hall, its surface scarred and battered, like someone had tried to claw their way through. Chester stopped, his eyes fixed on the door, his body tense and alert. He turned to me, and in that moment, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a warning, a plea. I swallowed, my hand shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room, empty except for a single, old chair in the center. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Chester stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the chair, and I realized he was trembling, his body tense with fear. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it, a faint, shadowy figure, barely visible, sitting in the chair, its head tilted toward us in a silent, unseeing gaze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, feel its cold, empty gaze boring into me. Chester let out a low growl, his hackles raised, his body pressed against my leg as if to protect me. I didn't understand, didn't know what he was trying to tell me, but I could feel his fear, feel his desperation to get me out of that room. I turned to leave, pulling Chester with me, but as I stepped into the hallway, I heard a voice, soft and whispery, like the wind passing through dead leaves. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, and I felt a chill settle over me, a coldness that seeped into my bones. I ran, pulling Chester along with me, my heart racing as we stumbled down the stairs and out into the blinding light of day. I didn't stop until we were back at home, safe within the familiar walls of our apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside a comforting reminder of normalcy. But Chester was different, quieter, more subdued. He didn't look at me the same way, didn't have that playful spark in his eyes. It was like something had changed between us, like he'd seen something I couldn't understand, something he could never unsee. For days, I tried to put it out of my mind, tried to convince myself that it was all a bad dream, a figment of my imagination. But every night, as I lay in bed, I could feel that cold gaze, that whisper of warning echoing in my mind. Chester stayed close to me, always watching, always alert, as if he knew that something had followed us back, something that was waiting, lurking in the shadows. And then, one night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room, something I couldn't see. He let out a low growl, his body tense, his gaze unwavering. I sat up, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but shadows and silence. Chester looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't explain, a sadness that seemed to say goodbye. The next morning, he was gone. I searched everywhere, calling his name, tearing the apartment apart in a desperate frenzy, but he was nowhere to be found. It was like he'd vanished, like he'd been taken by something I couldn't understand. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move on, tried to accept that Chester was gone. But every night, I could feel that cold presence, feel that whisper of warning echoing in my mind. And every night, I wondered if he'd left to protect me, if he'd sacrificed himself to keep me safe from something I couldn't see, something I couldn't fight. I don't know where he is, don't know if he's still out there, watching over me from some place beyond my understanding. But I know that he taught me an important lesson that day, that there are things in this world that we can't see, things that linger in the shadows, waiting, watching, and that sometimes, the ones we love will do anything to protect us from the darkness, even if it means leaving us behind. I was shunned by my family for choosing my passion. I was shunned by my family for choosing my passion. I still remember the day I told them, sitting around the dinner table with that uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. My mother was the first to speak, her voice trembling as she asked if I was serious, if I had truly made up my mind. My father wouldn't even look at me. My siblings sat there, eyes down, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. I had spent years suppressing my dreams, working in the family business, trying to be the son they wanted, the son who would carry on the legacy and make them proud. But it was suffocating, like being trapped in a life that wasn't mine, a life built on expectations that I'd never wanted for myself. So, when I finally told them that I was leaving, that I was done following their rules, their plans, their dreams, the air turned thick with tension, and I could feel their disappointment like a weight pressing down on me. They thought I was throwing my life away, abandoning everything they'd built, everything they'd sacrificed to give me, for something they saw as a foolish hobby, a fleeting obsession. But it wasn't a hobby to me, it was everything I'd ever wanted, the only thing that made me feel alive. I thought they'd understand, thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd support me, even if they didn't fully agree. But I was wrong. That night, my father told me that if I left, I was no longer part of the family, that I was dead to them. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I could feel my heart breaking, splintering under the weight of his anger and disappointment. My mother just cried, begging me to reconsider, to think about what I was giving up. My siblings sat in silence, their faces blank, their eyes refusing to meet mine. It was like I'd become a stranger, an outsider in my own home. When I packed my bags, there were no goodbyes, no tearful farewells. They just watched as I walked out the door, their faces cold, unfeeling. I tried to convince myself that they'd come around, that they'd see how happy I was, how much this meant to me, but as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the silence from them became deafening. They didn't call, didn't write, didn't check in to see if I was okay. It was like I'd never existed. I threw myself into my passion, working day and night, determined to prove them wrong, to show them that this wasn't a phase, that this was what I was meant to do. But no matter how much success I found, no matter how many milestones I reached, there was always this emptiness, this ache that reminded me of what I'd lost, of the family I'd left behind. I'd see them sometimes, in passing, walking down the street or at the grocery store, but they'd look right through me, like I was a ghost, a shadow of someone they used to know. The pain was unbearable, this feeling of being invisible, of being nothing more than a memory they'd chosen to erase. Then one night, I got a call from my sister, the first time I'd heard her voice in over a year. She sounded scared, her voice trembling as she told me that something was wrong, that our father was sick, that he didn't have much time left. My heart sank, the pain of the past year rushing back in a wave of guilt and regret. I wanted to go to him, to be there for him, to tell him that I was sorry, that I'd never meant to hurt him. But when I showed up at the hospital, my mother looked at me with a hatred I'd never seen before. She told me that I wasn't welcome, that I had no right to be there, that I'd given up my place in the family the day I'd walked out that door. I tried to explain, tried to make her understand that I was still their son, that I still loved them, but she wouldn't listen. She told me that I was selfish, that I'd broken their hearts, that I'd torn the family apart with my choices. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating under the weight of her words, her anger, her bitterness. My siblings wouldn't even look at me, their faces blank, cold, like they didn't know me. I was alone, standing in that sterile hospital hallway, the sounds of machines and distant voices echoing around me, and I realized that I had truly lost them, that they had cast me out, that I was nothing to them. In that moment, I felt a darkness settle over me, a hollow emptiness that I knew would never go away. I walked out of that hospital feeling like a part of me had died, like I'd lost a piece of my soul that I'd never get back. I went back to my life, to my passion, to the thing that had given me purpose, but it felt empty, meaningless. I'd spent so long trying to prove myself, trying to show them that I was more than their expectations, but in the end, I'd lost everything that had ever mattered to me. I don't know if I'll ever see them again, don't know if they'll ever forgive me. But I do know that the pain of being shunned, of being cast out by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. And every night, as I lie awake, haunted by memories of the family I once had, I wonder if it was all worth it, if following my passion was worth the price I paid. How a misunderstanding led to a major life change. How a misunderstanding led to a major life change. It all started with one small, innocent mistake, the kind you laugh about later, or at least, that's what I thought. It was late on a Thursday night, and I was exhausted, mindlessly scrolling through my emails when I saw one with an unfamiliar sender name. It looked important, something from a job recruiter I'd spoken to months ago but had never heard back from. The subject line read, "Urgent, last chance for your offer." My heart skipped a beat. My current job was okay, but I'd always dreamed of moving on to something bigger, more challenging. I'd almost forgotten about applying for this job. The waiting period had stretched on so long that I'd just assumed they'd gone with someone else. But here it was, a second chance, seemingly dropped into my lap at the exact moment I was feeling stuck. I opened the email and, without even taking a breath, scanned through it. It congratulated me on my supposed acceptance into the position, though it did mention that I had to respond by the end of the week to confirm my interest. It was already Thursday night. I panicked, glancing at the clock, realizing I barely had any time left. I shot off a quick response, heart pounding, trying to sound professional despite my excitement, and hit send. My thoughts immediately filled with plans for what was next, leaving my current job, packing up, moving to a new city. It was impulsive, yes, but something inside me told me this was right. The opportunity was too perfect to pass up. The next morning, I got a reply from the recruiter. Her tone was warm but slightly confused. She thanked me for my interest, but then mentioned something strange, just to confirm, "You're interested in continuing your work as a crisis counselor in the rehabilitation program, correct?" My blood ran cold. Crisis counselor. Rehabilitation program? I'd applied for a marketing position, something about this didn't add up. Frantically, I went back to reread the email chain, realizing in horror that I'd misunderstood the offer entirely. This wasn't a corporate job, it was an opening at a rural rehabilitation center, the kind of place I'd never even considered working. My stomach dropped, panic rising as I considered my options. I'd already quit my job, and if I backed out now, I'd have nothing. Yet the thought of working in a field I knew nothing about, helping people in situations I wasn't trained for, terrified me. But something inside me whispered that maybe this was meant to happen, a twist of fate urging me to take a path I'd never dared to explore. Feeling trapped, I decided to at least visit the center, thinking that maybe I could explain the situation and back out gracefully. I made the drive out to the location they'd listed, miles away from the bustling city I knew, deep into the woods, where the landscape turned quieter, more isolated. When I arrived, I was greeted by a kind older woman, named Ellen, who mistook my hesitant expression for first-day nerves and gave me a reassuring pat on the back. There was something so comforting about her presence, something that made it hard to tell her the truth. She led me inside, introducing me to the staff, all of whom greeted me warmly. They seemed so genuine, so eager to welcome someone they believed was here to make a difference. I felt a pang of guilt, realizing that these people were counting on me, seeing something in me that I didn't even see in myself. Before I knew it, they'd handed me a uniform, set me up in a small on-site cabin, and I found myself unpacking, too embarrassed to back out. That first night, I lay awake, questioning my sanity, feeling overwhelmed and out of place, wondering how I'd ended up here. But the next morning, as I walked into the common room, the residents greeted me with cautious but hopeful smiles. I could see the weight of their struggles, the silent battles they fought, and it shook something deep within me. I knew I didn't belong here, didn't have the skills they needed, but I stayed, partly because I didn't know how to leave and partly because something about it felt strangely right. Day by day, I got to know the residents, listened to their stories, their regrets, their hopes, and the hard-won victories that others rarely saw. I didn't have much to offer, but I found myself learning more about compassion, patience, and resilience than I'd ever learned in an office cubicle. I had been so wrapped up in the corporate ladder, in the pursuit of success, that I'd never stopped to understand what real hardship looked like, or what it felt like to help people through their darkest moments. Weeks turned into months, and I began to feel a sense of purpose, a fulfillment I'd never known before. It wasn't easy. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel out of my depth, didn't make mistakes. But the staff, the residents, they didn't hold it against me. They showed me kindness, understanding, and I learned from them, grew because of them. I come here because of a misunderstanding, an accident, yet now I couldn't imagine leaving. One night, I sat outside, watching the stars with a resident who had been through more pain than I could ever imagine. She looked at me, her face soft in the moonlight, and said, "I don't know how you ended up here, but you've helped me more than you know." Sometimes, life puts us exactly where we need to be, even if we don't see it at first. Her words struck me, and I realized she was right. Maybe I'd come here by mistake, but this place, these people, had given me a sense of purpose, a new understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. By the time I finally left that center, a year later, I was a different person. I didn't go back to the corporate world, didn't return to the life I'd once planned. Instead, I found myself drawn to nonprofit work, counseling, roles that allowed me to continue making a difference, however small. It was the biggest change I'd ever made, a shift I'd never expected. All because of a misunderstanding, a single email that led me down a path I'd never have chosen on my own. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, I think back to that night, to the fear and uncertainty, and I realize how grateful I am for that mistake, for the chance to find a new purpose in the most unlikely of places. The time I stood up to a bully, my unexpected victory. The time I stood up to a bully, my unexpected victory. I still remember the first day I met him, that towering figure with a look that could turn your blood cold and a voice like thunder, a kid everyone was scared of but no one dared to confront. We all knew his name, Aaron, whispered in hushed tones across hallways and behind closed doors. He'd made it his mission to remind everyone he was the strongest, the toughest, and he'd target anyone who dared to challenge that narrative, even if that challenge was unintentional. It wasn't long before I became his next target. I wasn't exactly the most popular kid, but I kept to myself, a strategy I thought would keep me out of harm's way. One day, in the middle of gym class, I happened to glance at Aaron's direction. He caught my eye, and I could see something change in his expression, like he'd found his next victim. From then on, it was almost daily, the shoves in the hallway, the snide comments muttered just loud enough for me to hear, the occasional accidental trip that sent me sprawling on the ground. I felt trapped, as though I was constantly looking over my shoulder, trying to anticipate where he'd come from next. I tried everything to avoid him, altering my routes, slipping out of class a few seconds early, even asking my teachers if I could sit closer to their desks, hoping that proximity to authority would protect me. But it didn't matter. Aaron always found a way, like he could smell my fear, and every time he pushed me around, I felt my self-worth crumble just a little bit more. The worst was that no one else seemed to notice, or maybe they just didn't care. My friends looked the other way, teachers chalked it up to boys being boys, and even my parents didn't really understand, advising me to ignore him and hoping he'd get bored. But Aaron wasn't the kind to get bored. I began dreading school, feigning sickness just to avoid facing another day of his torment. I'd lie awake at night, my mind spiraling with worry, every inch of my body tensed for the blows that would come tomorrow, wondering how long I could keep this up before something in me broke. But there was one thing that kept me going, a small glimmer of anger that simmered beneath the fear, a resentment that grew every time Aaron threw me against a locker or laughed in my face. I didn't know what to do with that anger, though. I felt powerless against someone so much bigger, so much stronger. Then one day, everything changed. It was a Wednesday afternoon, right after school, and I was walking home alone, taking my usual shortcut through the park, hoping to avoid Aaron and his entourage. But I should have known better. As I turned a corner, I saw him standing there, waiting, a smirk on his face that sent a chill down my spine. He walked up to me, blocking my path, taunting me, mocking me for being weak, calling me names that I'd heard 1,000 times but still cut deep. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, the familiar surge of fear, but something in me snapped. I don't know where the courage came from, maybe it was the months of pent-up anger, the countless nights I'd spent dreading him, the exhaustion from constantly running. But I took a step forward, meeting his gaze head-on, and I told him to back off. My voice shook, but I didn't back down. His smirk faltered, just for a second, replaced by a look of surprise that quickly morphed into rage. He shoved me, hard, but I didn't fall. I stood my ground, even though my heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. He tried again, but this time, something incredible happened. Someone saw. A woman walking her dog across the park had stopped, watching the confrontation unfold. She didn't know the whole story, didn't know who I was or who Aaron was, but she stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, telling him to leave me alone. And in that moment, I saw Aaron hesitate, saw him falter as the power he'd held over me slipped away. He mumbled something under his breath, gave me one last scowl, and then walked away, leaving me standing there, heart racing, hands trembling, but feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, pride. I'd done it. I'd stood up to him. I'd faced my fear, and even though it had taken the help of a stranger to drive him off, I realized that the power he'd held over me was gone. From that day on, Aaron never bothered me again. He'd look at me sometimes, a flicker of his old arrogance in his eyes, but he kept his distance. It was as if he knew that I wasn't the same person he'd bullied for months, that I'd found a strength inside me he couldn't break. And as the days turned into weeks, I started feeling lighter, like I'd shed a weight I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. I started to enjoy school again, started walking through the halls with my head held a little higher, no longer feeling the need to hide. It was an unexpected victory, one that didn't come with a triumphant moment or a grand gesture, but one that taught me more about myself than I could have ever imagined. I learned that standing up for myself didn't make me weak, didn't make me the target. It made me strong. And even though the fear hadn't completely vanished, even though I still had moments where I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, the victory I'd claimed that day had given me something even more powerful than confidence. It had given me the knowledge that I could stand up to my fears, that I was stronger than I'd ever realized. Looking back, I don't know if Aaron even remembers that day, if he thinks about me at all. But for me, it was a turning point, a moment that changed everything, a reminder that sometimes, the smallest acts of courage can lead to the biggest victories. And in the end, that's all that matters. A random act of kindness changed my day. A random act of kindness changed my day was how it all started, or at least, how I thought it started, because that morning I had barely managed to drag myself out of bed and into some semblance of a routine. Everything felt off, like the world was playing a cruel joke that only I was in on. My alarm didn't go off, my favorite shirt was wrinkled beyond repair, I spilled coffee on myself just as I was walking out the door. By the time I made it to the coffee shop near work, I was done, absolutely ready to call in sick and crawl back under my covers. But then, as I reached the counter, fumbling through my wallet, I heard a voice beside me say, "It's on me." I looked up to see a stranger, maybe in his 50s, dressed in an old tweed jacket that looked like it had seen better days, smiling at me warmly. Before I could refuse, he handed the cashier a crumpled bill and turned to me with the strangest smile. "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his gaze piercing and unblinking. I didn't know how to respond, so I just mumbled a thank you and took my coffee, thinking maybe he was just a lonely man trying to make small talk, but something about his eyes followed me even as I walked out of the shop. At first, I shrugged it off, maybe he was just trying to be friendly, a little eccentric, sure, but harmless. But then, as I went about my day, I couldn't shake his words. It was as if they'd woven themselves into my thoughts, resurfacing at the strangest times, his voice echoing in my mind, "Kindness opens doors." It got stranger when I went into the bathroom at work and saw those exact words, "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," written on the mirror in a faint, foggy smudge. I laughed it off, thinking maybe it was a coincidence, or maybe someone else had heard the same line. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the words seemed to haunt me. I started noticing little things. A stranger would smile at me on the subway, or someone would hold the door open just a second too long, staring a little too hard, their expression too intense. The day slipped by in a strange blur of overly kind faces and lingering stares, and by evening, I was starting to feel the weight of it, an itch I couldn't scratch. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the world was pressing in, like every kind act I received had some hidden meaning I couldn't see. It wasn't until I nearly got hit by a car crossing the street that I realized something was really wrong. I hadn't even seen it coming, but just as it barreled toward me, a hand grabbed my arm and yanked me back onto the curb. I turned to thank my rescuer, only to find an old woman smiling at me with the same eerie, knowing expression as the stranger from the coffee shop. "Kindness opens doors no one else can see," she whispered before shuffling away, her gaze lingering on me just a second too long. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding as I watched her disappear into the crowd. At that moment, something clicked, a horrifying realization that maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. The phrase echoed in my mind, growing louder, feeding the paranoia creeping into my bones. I tried to brush it off, tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was horribly wrong. People started acting different around me, like they knew something I didn't, smiling at me with that same unsettling look, muttering the same words under their breath. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, but every time I looked around, there they were, strangers, friends, even my own reflection seemed to watch me with that eerie, knowing gaze. I tried calling friends, tried telling them what was happening, but no one took me seriously, chalking it up to stress or lack of sleep. As night fell, I found myself wandering the streets, desperate to escape the invisible weight pressing down on me. I needed answers, needed to find the stranger from the coffee shop and demand he explain what he'd done to me. Somehow, I knew he was the key to all of this, the only one who could make it stop. After hours of searching, I finally spotted him in a dimly lit cafe, sitting alone at a corner table. I stormed up to him, my hands shaking, demanding to know why he'd said those words, why everyone was repeating them, what he'd done to me. He looked up, his eyes calm and cold, and said, "Kindness opens doors no one else can see, but you must be willing to step through." He didn't say anything more, just smiled that strange, empty smile, and in that moment, I realized with a sickening dread that I'd never be free. I was trapped, a puppet to some twisted kindness I didn't understand, doomed to carry his message, to spread his words, to watch that same madness take root in others. As I left the cafe, I found myself repeating his words to a passing stranger, my voice trembling, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as their face shifted, their eyes clouding over with the same haunted look I'd seen in my own. The truth about my best friend's mysterious behavior. The truth about my best friend's mysterious behavior started as a small worry in the back of my mind, a tickle of concern that I could almost ignore, but by the time it really came to the surface, it had twisted itself into something bigger, something I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried. My best friend, Alex, had always been a little quirky, but that was part of what I loved about him. He was the kind of person who could make anyone laugh at the drop of a hat, the guy who showed up at your door with pizza when you were having a bad day, and the friend who would drive across town at 2 in the morning if you needed someone to talk to. But a few months ago, something in him changed. It started small. He'd cancel plans out of nowhere, his usually warm texts growing short and curt. At first, I brushed it off, assuming he was just busy with work or stressed about something he wasn't ready to talk about. But then he started disappearing for days on end, ignoring my messages and phone calls, and when he did finally resurface, he looked different. Gaunt, tired, like he hadn't slept in days. He'd shrug it off with a weak smile, claiming he'd just been caught up in things, but there was a strange look in his eyes, something hollow that didn't belong to the Alex I knew. One night, when he finally agreed to meet up, I decided to confront him. He looked worse than ever, dark circles under his eyes, his usually well-groomed appearance replaced by a scruffy, unkempt look, and I could tell he was nervous, his eyes darting around the room like he was afraid someone would overhear us. I asked him point-blank what was going on, if he was in some kind of trouble, but he just laughed it off, saying I was being paranoid. But then he leaned forward and whispered, "I can't tell you, okay? It's not safe. For either of us." That should have been my cue to leave it alone, to respect his privacy, but I couldn't let it go. I started noticing strange things after that, things I might have dismissed before, but now they all felt connected. I'd see him wandering around at odd hours, his movements stiff and mechanical, like he was being controlled by something else. Once, I even caught him standing in front of my apartment building at 3 in the morning, just staring up at my window with a blank, unseeing expression on his face. When I confronted him about it the next day, he acted like he had no memory of it, shrugging it off with an awkward laugh. Then I started getting these weird messages, anonymous texts that felt like warnings, telling me to stay away from him and that I didn't know what I was getting into. But I couldn't stay away, couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, horribly wrong with my friend, and that whatever he was mixed up in was darker than anything I could imagine. The breaking point came when I got a call from Alex's mom. She told me he'd been acting strange at home too, that he'd lock himself in his room for days on end, only coming out to grab food in the middle of the night. She was terrified, saying she'd caught him talking to himself in his room, arguing with someone who wasn't there. Desperate for answers, I decided to follow him one night, trailing him to an abandoned building on the outskirts of town. I watched as he slipped inside, his movements jerky and unnatural, like he was fighting against something unseen. I waited for what felt like hours before he finally emerged, his eyes blank and his face expressionless. But then he saw me. His face twisted in horror, and he grabbed me, his grip vice-like as he whispered, "You shouldn't be here. They're watching." He wouldn't tell me who they were, only that they had control over him, that he was bound to them in ways I couldn't understand. That night, he begged me to leave him alone, to pretend we'd never met, and though every instinct in me screamed to help him, I could see the desperation in his eyes. It was like he knew there was no way out, like he'd already accepted his fate. I left him there, feeling sick with guilt, but I couldn't bring myself to forget him, not when every corner of my apartment seemed to hold reminders of our friendship, of the person he used to be. Days turned into weeks, and I didn't see him, didn't hear from him, and I started to wonder if maybe he'd found a way to escape. But then, one night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of my bed, his face pale and his eyes empty, like he was barely human anymore. He reached out to me, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "They're here. They're coming for you too." And then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness before I could even scream. I haven't seen him since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my door, feel eyes watching me from the shadows, and I know that whatever had him hasn't forgotten about me. I can't sleep anymore, can't shake the feeling that one day, I'll wake up with that same empty look in my eyes, that I'll become just another puppet for whatever dark force claimed my best friend. I tried to warn people, tried to tell his family, his friends, but they all looked at me like I was crazy, like I'd finally cracked under the pressure. But I know the truth. I know they're out there, watching, waiting, and I can feel them getting closer every day. How I turned a bad day into a great one, my journey. How I turned a bad day into a great one, my journey started with a morning that couldn't have gone worse if I'd tried. It was as though every little thing conspired to ruin my day before it even began. My alarm didn't go off, my coffee maker broke, and as I rushed out the door with an empty stomach and frayed nerves, I stepped directly into a puddle that soaked my only pair of decent shoes. I considered just calling in sick right then, but something inside me insisted that maybe I could still salvage it, so I trudged on, convincing myself that things would get better. On the subway, however, things only got worse. A guy with no sense of personal space bumped into me and spilled his coffee all over my clothes. I barely managed to stifle my frustration, plastering on a forced smile, and tried to clean myself up with a crumpled tissue I found in my pocket. My boss had already been on my case about my negative energy, so I told myself to hold it together and keep going, convinced that my luck had to change at some point. But as I arrived at work, I realized I'd forgotten an important presentation file, left sitting on my desk at home. I felt the dread sink in, knowing my boss would use this as yet another reason to reprimand me, and I braced myself for what was sure to be a disastrous day. In a moment of desperation, I decided to take a quick walk to clear my head, hoping that maybe a change of scenery would help. As I walked down a quiet alleyway, something caught my eye, a small, faded sign that I'd never noticed before, pointing toward a door with the words Fortunes and Fresh Starts painted in peeling letters above it. Normally, I'd never even think about going into a place like that, but something about the day had worn down my usual skepticism, and I felt this strange pull, an urge to just walk in and see if maybe, just maybe, there was something there that could help me turn things around. Inside, the shop was dimly lit and filled with the scent of old books and incense, the walls lined with shelves of odd trinkets, crystals, and dusty bottles. A woman with piercing green eyes sat behind the counter, looking up at me with a knowing smile as though she'd been expecting me. "Bad day?" she asked, her voice soft yet oddly compelling, and I found myself nodding before I could stop myself. She motioned for me to sit, and before I knew it, she was spreading out a set of tarot cards, her eyes narrowing as she studied them intently. "You've got a lot of negative energy surrounding you," she murmured, flipping over one card after another, and the more she spoke, the more I felt this strange tingling sensation, like something deep inside me was shifting. When she finished, she looked at me with a seriousness that sent chills down my spine. "Today, you have the chance to turn everything around, but it won't be easy," she said, handing me a small glass vial filled with a murky liquid. "Drink this at the end of the day, and everything you need to know will be revealed." I almost laughed, ready to brush her off as some kind of scam artist, but something in her eyes kept me from walking away. I took the vial, thanking her awkwardly, and headed back to work, trying to shake off the bizarre encounter. The rest of the day was just as terrible as I'd expected. My boss scolded me in front of everyone for the missing file, my coworkers avoided me, and by lunchtime, I was ready to break down. But every time I thought about leaving, I felt the weight of that vial in my pocket, a strange reminder that I had one last option, no matter how ridiculous it seemed. As the day finally ended, I found myself alone in the office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I sat at my desk, staring at the vial. I felt stupid, part of me convinced it was nothing but colored water, yet another part of me felt that tingling again, stronger than ever. Without letting myself think too much, I uncorked it and took a sip, expecting some terrible taste, but to my surprise, it was almost sweet, like honey with a hint of something herbal. Almost instantly, I felt a rush of warmth spread through me, a strange sensation that was both comforting and exhilarating. And then, as I sat there, I began to notice something odd. Everything around me seemed sharper, more vivid, as though a veil had been lifted. My senses felt heightened, my thoughts clearer, and I realized with a shock that the weight of the day's frustrations had melted away, leaving me feeling lighter than I had in years. That's when I noticed the whispers, faint but unmistakable, like a dozen voices murmuring just out of earshot. I stood up, looking around, but the office was empty. The whispers grew louder, their tones soothing and encouraging, and as I listened, I felt a surge of confidence, a conviction that I could handle anything. I made my way out of the office, the world seeming to shift around me, the lights flickering as I walked down the hallway. By the time I reached the street, everything looked different, almost surreal, as though I were seeing it all for the first time. People passed by with friendly smiles, nodding at me as though they knew me, and I felt an odd kinship with everyone I saw. The whispers guided me, their words filling me with a sense of purpose, and I found myself walking to places I'd never been, meeting people who felt like old friends. Each encounter left me feeling more alive, more connected, and I realized that the darkness of the morning had been completely replaced by this strange, exhilarating light. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew more insistent, urging me to take risks, to push boundaries, to explore places I'd never considered before. I found myself in unfamiliar neighborhoods, alleys that seemed to twist and shift around me, the buildings looming higher than they should. The more I walked, the more I felt myself changing, shedding layers of fear and doubt, until I no longer recognized the person I'd been that morning. By the time I returned home, I was a different person, filled with a power I couldn't fully understand, and as I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the face staring back at me. It was me, and yet something more, something that had been unlocked by the woman's potion, by the whispers that still lingered in my mind. I thought about returning to her shop, asking her what she'd done, but deep down, I knew the answer. I'd been given a gift, a chance to turn my life around, and all it had taken was one bad day, one leap of faith, and a mysterious vial. As I lay down to sleep, the whispers faded, leaving me in a silence that was both peaceful and charged with possibility. And though I knew I'd never be the same, I welcomed the change, ready to face whatever the next day would bring. A work crisis turned friendship into a rivalry. A work crisis turned friendship into a rivalry began innocently enough, starting with a crisis at work that none of us saw coming, especially not me and my best friend, Jake, who'd been my partner in crime since day one. We'd started together at the company, working late nights, pulling each other up when things got rough, sharing laughs over beers after long days, even talking about our dreams of moving up together, maybe someday starting a business of our own. Our friendship felt rock solid, a rare kind of bond I never thought could be touched by something as superficial as office politics. But then, everything changed in a single email that sent the office into a frenzy. It came from the CEO, announcing that the company was going through a major restructuring, and with it came whispers of job cuts, demotions, and a desperate scramble for survival. Jake and I tried to keep cool, but when we found out that our manager was getting laid off and one of us would be chosen to replace her, that's when things started to shift. I could feel the tension building between us, even though neither of us wanted to admit it. At first, we tried to joke about it, saying we'd let the company decide and that it wouldn't come between us, but deep down, I felt this simmering fear that Jake might want the position just as much as I did. The next day, our supervisor pulled us aside separately to discuss our qualifications and future goals, and I found myself, for the first time, talking about Jake as competition. It felt wrong, like I was betraying him, but when the supervisor hinted that the decision might come down to who was willing to step up more aggressively, I felt this strange rush, a drive to prove myself even if it meant going up against my friend. After that, things started to spiral. We stopped talking as much, our once easy banter replaced by awkward silences and forced smiles, each of us pretending we weren't feeling the pressure. The worst part was how subtle it all was, small moments of tension, glances that lingered a little too long, the way we both started staying late at the office, each of us pretending it was for the love of the job, but knowing deep down we were both trying to make an impression. One night, I walked past his desk and saw him working on a project that, technically, wasn't even his to handle, it was part of my workload. When I confronted him, he just shrugged and said he was only trying to help, but I could hear the smugness in his voice, like he was trying to prove he could do my job better than me. After that, everything became a competition: who could get to work earlier, who stayed later, who could take on more assignments. I tried to tell myself I wasn't being petty, that I was just doing my best, but each time I saw Jake outdoing me, something inside me twisted, a bitter resentment I couldn't ignore. Then came the project proposal. It was a high-stakes presentation that would decide who got the promotion, and we were both given the opportunity to pitch our ideas. I spent countless hours on mine, perfecting every detail, going over every slide, rehearsing until I knew it by heart. The night before the presentation, I got an email from Jake, saying he'd accidentally seen my proposal when he borrowed my laptop earlier in the week, and he wanted to give me some feedback. His words were passive-aggressive, little jabs disguised as helpful suggestions, and it was clear he'd gone through every slide, picking it apart in a way that felt less like advice and more like sabotage. I stayed up all night rewriting the entire thing, fueled by anger and exhaustion, knowing he'd probably be doing the same. The next morning, as we both stood in the conference room waiting for our turn, I could see the change in him. He looked at me like a stranger, his eyes cold and calculating, and for a moment, I felt like I was looking at someone I didn't even know. When he gave his presentation, he was confident, polished, hitting all the points I'd known he'd emphasize, and when he finished, he shot me a look that was half smirk, half dare, like he was daring me to top it. I gave my presentation with everything I had, pouring my heart into it, trying to remind myself that I was just as capable as he was, but by the end, I felt this hollow pit in my stomach, like I'd just fought a battle I never wanted to fight. The decision came the next day. Our boss called us in, congratulated us both on our hard work, and then told us the promotion would go to Jake. I forced a smile, congratulated him, but the bitterness in my voice was impossible to hide. After that, things went downhill fast. Jake started treating me like an underling, throwing his weight around, delegating tasks to me with this condescending tone, like he'd forgotten we were ever equals. I tried to keep my head down, tried to remind myself that he'd earned it, but every day, the resentment grew. I started noticing things, small slights, tasks he'd assigned to me that were impossible to complete in the time he'd given, public criticisms that felt personal, like he was deliberately trying to undermine me. I knew he was testing me, pushing me to see how far I'd let him go, and I hated that I was letting him get to me. One night, after a particularly brutal meeting where he'd humiliated me in front of everyone, I confronted him, cornering him in the break room. We argued, our voices low and tense, the air thick with years of unspoken resentment that had finally come to the surface. He accused me of trying to sabotage him, of being jealous of his success, and I accused him of betraying our friendship, of using me as a stepping stone. The argument ended with him storming out, leaving me standing there, feeling like I'd lost more than just a job. After that, we stopped speaking entirely. He became my boss in every sense, treating me like any other employee. Our friendship reduced to bitter glances and cold silences. I'd hear people talking about him, praising his leadership, and each compliment felt like a slap in the face. I thought about quitting, about leaving and starting fresh, but a part of me refused to let him win, refused to give up the job I'd worked so hard for. Eventually, I realized the person I once called my best friend was gone, replaced by someone who cared more about power and status than loyalty and trust. I'd learned a hard lesson about the cost of ambition, about how easily friendship can turn into rivalry, and as I sat at my desk, staring at the empty space where Jake used to sit, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd ever be able to trust anyone at work again. When I discovered my partner's hidden talent, a surprise. When I discovered my partner's hidden talent, a surprise was one of those moments you only read about in books or see in movies, the kind of thing you never actually think will happen to you. My partner, Ben, had always been quiet and somewhat reserved, the type of person who preferred to stay in the background at parties, content to listen rather than talk, and while he was a kind, funny, and incredibly supportive partner, he'd never given me any reason to think he was hiding something extraordinary. We'd been together for 3 years, living in a small, cozy apartment that suited us just fine, a life filled with routines that were comfortable and predictable, which was exactly how I thought we both liked it. Ben was an accountant by day, a creature of habit who'd rather spend an evening watching reruns of sitcoms on the couch than going out on some wild adventure. So, imagine my shock when, during a casual evening at home, I stumbled upon something that turned my entire understanding of him upside down. It happened completely by accident. I was cleaning out the closet while he was out running errands, looking for an old photo album I hadn't seen in a while, when my hand brushed against a dusty, nondescript box tucked away in the far corner. It was one of those old wooden boxes with intricate carvings on the lid, something that looked too old to belong to Ben, who I'd never known to have a sentimental attachment to anything other than his favorite coffee mug. Curious, I pulled it out, wiping away years of dust, and pried it open, half expecting to find some forgotten trinket or maybe an old journal. Instead, what I found left me speechless. Inside was a small stack of photographs, not of Ben or his family but of stunningly realistic paintings, each one more breathtaking than the last. They were of landscapes, cities, people, some smiling, some looking wistful, each one imbued with a life and emotion that seemed to leap off the paper. I thought at first that maybe he'd bought these or collected them somehow, but something about the way the box was hidden, the careful way they were arranged, told me these paintings were more than just a collection. Beneath the photographs was a small sketchbook, the pages filled with quick, meticulous sketches of everything from animals to bustling city streets, each one done with such precision that it was like peering into a frozen moment in time. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, and that's when I saw it, a small, folded note tucked into the back of the box, with the words to remember scrawled across the front in Ben's familiar handwriting. My heart pounded as I unfolded it, feeling as though I was intruding on something deeply personal, but my curiosity had completely taken over. The note was short, barely more than a few lines, but it hit me like a punch. It read, "To remember who I was before I became who I am. To remember the part of me I had to leave behind." I sat there, staring at the note, feeling a strange mixture of confusion and awe. Who was this person I'd been living with for 3 years, and what was this hidden life he'd left behind? That evening, when Ben returned home, I couldn't keep it to myself. I held up the box, feeling my hands shake slightly, and asked him point blank, "Ben, what is this?" He froze, his face draining of color as he looked from the box to me, a flicker of something unrecognizable in his eyes. For a moment, he looked like he was about to deny everything, but then he let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair, and sat down on the edge of the bed, motioning for me to join him. What he told me was a story I could have never expected. As it turned out, before he met me, before he settled into the life I thought was all he'd ever known, Ben had been an artist, a serious, passionate artist who had once dreamed of making a living from his paintings. He'd spent years studying, honing his skills, pouring everything he had into his art, and for a while, he'd even been on the verge of his big break. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Just as he was gaining recognition, he'd been hit with a series of personal setbacks, family issues, financial troubles, things that had pulled him away from his dream, forcing him to find a stable job, to grow up and leave his art behind. He kept it hidden, he said, because he didn't want me to see him as a failure, as someone who'd given up on his dreams, and he didn't want to open that part of himself again. But now, as he spoke, I could see something in his eyes, a spark, a flicker of the passion he'd buried for so long, and I felt a swell of something indescribable, a mix of love, admiration, and a strange sadness for the person he'd been and the dreams he'd left behind. After that night, something shifted between us. I encouraged him, gently, to pick up a paintbrush again, to try creating just for himself, no pressure, no expectations. At first, he resisted, claiming he was too rusty, that he'd lost whatever talent he once had, but I could see the way his fingers itched whenever he looked at a blank canvas. So, one day, I surprised him with a set of paints and brushes, leaving them on the kitchen table with a note that simply said, "For the artist in you." It took a few days, but one evening, I came home to find him sitting at the table, paintbrush in hand, a half-finished landscape spread out before him. He looked up at me, his face a mixture of nerves and excitement, and I knew in that moment that the person I'd known for 3 years was just one part of him, and now I was meeting another, deeper part that he'd hidden away. Over the next few weeks, he began to paint more and more, each canvas revealing a different piece of his soul, a side of him I'd never seen. The more he painted, the more he opened up, telling me stories of his past, of the years he'd spent chasing his dream, of the sacrifices he'd made, the things he'd lost along the way. Watching him rediscover his talent was like witnessing a transformation, a rebirth of sorts, and I felt honored to be a part of it, to see him come alive in a way I'd never seen before. Eventually, he started sharing his work online, hesitant at first, but as the positive feedback poured in, I saw his confidence grow, that old spark reignited, brighter than ever. One night, he showed me a message from an art gallery interested in his work, and the look on his face was one of pure disbelief, like he couldn't quite accept that his talent, his passion, had found its way back into his life. That night, as we celebrated with a bottle of wine and talked about the future, I realized that our relationship had deepened in a way I'd never thought possible. I hadn't just discovered his hidden talent, I'd uncovered a part of his soul, a piece of him he'd kept locked away, and in doing so, I felt like I'd fallen in love with him all over again, this time with a new understanding, a new appreciation for the person he truly was, both the man I'd known and the artist he'd become once more.